On the afternoon of August 13th, 2018, police stood inside a quiet house in Frederick, Colorado, trying to figure out how a pregnant woman and her two little girls could disappear without taking any of the things they would normally need. Shanann Watts' purse was still there. Her phone was still there. Her medication was still there. Her car was sitting in the garage. Nothing about that scene made sense if she had chosen to leave. And right in the middle of it all was her husband, Chris Watts, moving from room to room, speaking softly, trying to act like a confused husband who had no idea where his family had gone. That was the mystery in those first hours. Where were Shanann, Bella, and Celeste? And why did the one person who should have been most desperate to find them seem so strangely calm? To understand why that question hit so hard, you have to know what the Watts family looked like from the outside. They had the kind of life people recognize instantly online. A nice suburban house, family videos, smiling photos, two young daughters filling the rooms with noise and movement. Shanann was outgoing and active on social media, always sharing pieces of daily life. Chris came across very differently. He was quiet, reserved, the sort of man who could fade into the background and still leave people thinking he was reliable. And in the summer of 2018, Shanann was pregnant with their son. From a distance, it looked like a family in the middle of building something. But by then, pressure had already started building inside the house. The family was struggling financially. The marriage was strained. Shanann had spent several weeks in North Carolina with the girls, and during that time Chris started an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. While Shanann was trying to understand why he had become distant, Chris was living in a second reality, one where he was already imagining a future that did not include the family he had made. That hidden split matters, not because it explains the crime away, but because it changes how the final days look. By the time Shanann came home in August, the break inside the marriage was already there. Early on August 13th, after a business trip to Arizona, Shanann was dropped off at home shortly after 2 a.m. Security footage later showed her walking inside. She was never seen alive again. Later that morning, small things started going wrong in a way her friends noticed almost immediately. Shanann missed a doctor's appointment. She stopped answering calls and texts. That was not normal for her. She was known for staying connected, responding, keeping people updated. One of her friends, Nicole Atkinson, did not brush it off. That decision changed everything. Instead of waiting a day and hoping Shanann would turn up, Nicole went to the house. She knocked, she kept trying, and when she still could not reach her, a welfare check was requested. That pushed the story into motion before Chris had much time to settle into whatever version of events he meant to present. When police arrived later that day, Chris eventually came home and let them inside. At first glance, he gave them the role he wanted them to see: worried husband, confused father, a man whose family had somehow vanished. But the house was working against him. A woman who planned to leave does not usually abandon her purse, her phone, her medication, and her vehicle, all in one shot. A mother does not normally disappear with two children and leave behind almost everything that would make that possible. And then there was Chris himself. People who have watched the body camera footage from that welfare check still talk about the feeling of it. Suspicion seems to creep in room by room. Chris does not come across like a frantic husband racing ahead of the police, opening doors, searching, asking questions, throwing out possibilities. He comes across like a man trying to stay in control of how he is being seen. Sometimes he says very little. Sometimes he says too much. Neither one feels natural. At one point, police and a neighbor reviewed surveillance footage from nearby. Chris stood there with them, watching. The neighbor later said Chris was acting so strangely that he immediately felt something is wrong. That feeling spread fast. By the next day, the disappearance had turned into national news. Chris Watts stepped outside his house and gave a television interview, asking for Shanann and the girls to come home. On paper, it should have helped him. Instead, it did almost the opposite. A lot of people who saw that interview came away unsettled. He smiled at odd moments. His voice stayed flat. The words sounded like the right words, but the emotion under them felt missing. He did not look like a man in the middle of a nightmare. He looked like somebody trying to perform what panic was supposed to look like. That public appearance became one of the most remembered parts of the case, not because it solved anything by itself, but because it captured the strange gap between Chris's calm exterior and what investigators were starting to suspect. And behind the scenes, the pressure on him was getting tighter. Investigators were looking at his movements, his phone activity, and his work schedule. Chris worked for Anadarko Petroleum, and on the same morning his family disappeared, he had driven out to a remote oil field tied to his job. That detail quickly became important. Then came the polygraph. Chris agreed to take one. He failed, and after that, the version of the story he had been trying to hold together started falling apart. When investigators pressed harder, Chris did not go straight to the truth. First, he tried to put the blame on Shanann. He claimed that after an emotional argument, she had harmed the children, and that he killed her in rage afterward. It was an ugly attempt to turn the murdered mother into the villain. Investigators did not buy it. Eventually, Chris admitted that Shanann was dead. He also admitted that Bella and Celeste were dead. Then investigators went to the remote Anadarko oil site connected to his route that morning. What they found there was horrifying. Shanann had been buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste had been hidden separately inside oil tanks. That discovery ended the missing persons story and exposed what this had really been from the beginning. The details that came out after that only made the case darker. According to Chris's later statements and court records referenced in the article, he strangled Shanann after an argument in their bedroom. He then loaded Shanann and the girls into his work truck and drove to the oil site before sunrise. One of the children may still have been alive during that drive. That part has stayed with people for years, not only because of the cruelty, but because it strips away any idea that this was one sudden explosion that ended before he understood what he was doing. There was time. There were chances to stop. There were moments when he could have turned back. He did not. And that is part of why this case hit people so hard. There was no mystery intruder, no complicated criminal plot, no hidden enemy stalking the family from outside. The danger was already in the house. As investigators pieced the motive together, it looked brutally simple. Chris wanted out. He wanted the affair. He wanted a different life. He wanted to get away from debt, pressure, responsibility, and the family life he had started to see as something standing in his way. That smallness is part of what makes the case so hard to sit with. The motive does not come wrapped in some huge dramatic story. It is bleak and selfish and frighteningly plain. A man wanted a reset, and his family paid for it. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no full trial, no long courtroom fight where every detail played out in public over weeks. In one sense, that closed the case quickly. But it did not make the story easier to absorb. If anything, it left the same question hanging in the air for a lot of people. How could someone who looked so quiet, so mild, so forgettable on the surface, be carrying something this dark, without the people around him fully seeing it? That question is one reason the case never really faded. Another reason is Shanann herself. In many true crime stories, victims can start to feel distant, like names in a timeline. That did not happen here. Through her videos and social media posts, Shanann remained vividly present. So did Bella and Celeste. People did not have to imagine a faceless family. They could see them, hear them, watch ordinary moments from their lives, only to realize those moments were leading towards something none of them could see. That gives the case a kind of closeness that is hard to shake. And then there is the evidence trail itself, the welfare check, the surveillance footage, the porch interview, the polygraph, the confession. It all unfolded in a way that let the world watch the mask slip a little at a time. At first, Chris stood in the role of the worried husband. Then, the house started contradicting him. Then his behavior started contradicting him. Then the evidence did. And finally, he did. By the end, what made the story so unforgettable was not just the violence. It was the betrayal inside it. The person Shanann and the girls should have been safest with was the one they needed protection from. For a brief stretch of time, he stood in front of cameras and acted as if he wanted them back, while investigators were moving closer to the truth of what he had already done. That is the part people still remember. Not just the suburban house, not just the oil field, not just the headlines. It is that split between appearance and reality. A man with a soft voice standing in daylight. A missing family. A house that looked normal, until police stepped inside and started noticing all the things that should not have been left behind. And a story that piece by piece stopped being a search and became the record of a family annihilation. In the end, Chris Watts got the different life he had imagined in the worst possible form. Not freedom, not a fresh start, a prison sentence for the rest of his life, and a case that will always be tied to the morning he tried to pretend his family had simply vanished. But Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the son Shanann was carrying are the real center of this story. What happened to them is why the case endures, not as a mystery, as a warning about how little appearances can tell you, and how quickly a picture-perfect home can turn into the scene of something unforgivable.